Hey, welcome back to Anti-Social Studies and my ongoing series all about the AP history exam. So last episode, we talked about using the documents to support your argument, but there are more points to be had for talking about those same documents if you evaluate them. So let's talk about what that means. So when the AP exam asks you to evaluate a document, that means they want you to address one of these things, right? You're not addressing all of them for all of the documents. That would be exhausting. They want you to address either the historical situation, the intended audience, the purpose, or the point of view, or a combination of those things. You can overlap and talk about a little like purpose and point of view kind of together. That's totally fine. You don't have to, you only have to do one. Here's the trick though. The big part of this is this and. And you have to connect whatever you talked about back to your argument. So the question I'm going to kind of have you thinking about in the back of your mind as you're writing these evaluations of the documents is, so what? Why do we care? Why do we care who wrote the document? How does that impact our understanding of what's in the document? Okay, so how many points can you get from these? You can get up to 2 points, which is a big change. So this is the biggest change that the College Board made in their new kind of 2020 10-point rubric. Used to, you had to evaluate 3 different documents to get 1 point on the rubric. And so honestly, I told all my students, like, ignore it. Don't even worry about it. It's not worth your time. Now it is worth your time because for each document that you evaluate, you can get a point, up to 2. And so if you evaluate, let's say, the intended audience of document 1, and you do it successfully, you get a point. And then let's say later on in your essay, you're talking about document 5 and you evaluate the point of view and maybe a little bit of the purpose. Great, you get another point. I want to be really clear here. These are 2 separate documents. So let's say in this example, right, you evaluated both the purpose and the point of view. That doesn't give you 2 points. You've still just evaluated 1 document. So make sure that you are attempting this for 2 different documents if you're trying to get full credit. But again, if you're running out of time, you only have 5 minutes left and you can only get to 1, great. I would spend that time making sure that 1 is really good and gets you the credit so that you know you get the point, rather than rushing through and trying to get 2 and maybe doing neither of them very well. Okay, so let's talk about what each of these things look like, right? The acronym that I use is HIPP, so historical situation, intended audience, purpose, and point of view. Your class might have something different. English classes then have something different. It's all the same though. If your teacher talked about AP parts or SOAPs or Hippo or whatever, it's all the same idea. They basically want you zooming out from the document and evaluating the document itself, not the contents of it, but like, who made it? Where was it made? Who was it intended for? What was happening at the time that this thing was published? And how does that help us better understand what is in the document? That's the skill that they're looking for here. And what I think you'll find is that this is one of those parts of the rubric where you will really benefit if you have been reviewing and studying your history on your own, right? So there's some parts of the rubric that you can kind of get away with just reading the document and figuring it out from there. But it's really hard to evaluate these aspects of the document unless you know other things that are going on, and maybe you know some of the people involved or whatever. So again, this is another motivation to be studying like normal, even though it's an open note test. First, historical situation. Historical situation means what was going on when this document was created that directly impacts the contents of the document. This in some ways is very similar to contextualization or context, which we'll talk about in a few episodes, but they're 2 different points. Very briefly, contextualization, the general context point, means you're providing context for your entire argument, for the whole prompt, for the whole topic of your essay. This means you are talking very specifically about the historical context of this document and what was going on in the place where this document was made. Again, this is one that's hard to do if you don't have a pretty decent knowledge of history. So let's say you got this cartoon. It's a pretty famous cartoon about basically Chinese exclusion in the United States. It was published in the late 1800s in the United States. The AP exam would give you that. I just left the US off, sorry. Let's say that this was being used for a prompt in AP World History that was maybe something like evaluate responses to migrations in the late 19th century. right? And so they're talking about people are moving all around the world. How are other states and people responding to that? The simple answer would be for this cartoon, not well. They don't necessarily like everyone who's moving and everyone who's trying to come to the United States. Groups that they believe are inferior, big air quotes there, are often excluded. So that's your answer. That's you using this document to say some groups like the Chinese were excluded. And so the response to these migrations was to keep out some people. Now, to evaluate the document, you want to zoom out. And let's say you want to talk about the historical situation. What that means is you're talking about what was going on in the United States in this time period. You don't have to know like exactly the year, what was happening in 1882. Although, if you're an APUSH, hopefully you do know that 1882 was when we passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. But whatever. You don't have to know that exactly, but you want to like limit your evaluation specifically to the late 1800s in the United States. What I mean by that is in my fictional prompt, I said, evaluate responses to migrations in the late 19th century. You can't contextualize this document by just saying, in the late 19th century, people were migrating, like people from China were migrating to the United States. No, we already know that. We know that from the document, right? And we know that from the prompt. What we want to know is like, what was happening in the United States in the late 1800s that would make them create a cartoon like this or approach Chinese immigrants in this negative way? And so what you might bring up is the Gilded Age and urbanization and the fact that cities were growing, there was growing poverty, there were a lot of immigrants coming in from all over the world, especially Europe. And so there was probably a large group of people who felt like all these immigrants were coming in and possibly taking jobs away. As the cities are growing and getting harder and harder to live in, there's a lot more competition for resources. That's what they mean by the historical situation, specifically of the US in this time period that relates to this attitude. Another example, that's sort of more a US history focused example. If you're in world history and you're like, I haven't learned about the Gilded Age, you could talk about the Opium Wars. Right? Specific context would be, well, this is just a few decades after the Opium Wars. And there's a lot of kind of chaos going on in China right now. They just finished the Taiping Rebellion and they're in the midst of this kind of radical change. So that might explain why some countries like the United States were a little bit nervous about letting people from China in because they were perceived as like addicted to opium and constantly rebelling and overthrowing their government, right? Okay, intended audience. So who was the document created for originally? And how does that impact what's being said or shown in the document? Meaning, are certain parts of the document being exaggerated to benefit the audience or make the audience like it more? Are certain parts being maybe excluded or minimized, that sort of thing? So this is from Christopher Columbus from his captain's log as he's describing his first encounter with the indigenous people of the Americas. And so he's writing things like, they willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built with good bodies. Gross. They don't bear arms. They cut themselves with a sword out of ignorance. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. Awesome. Thanks, Columbus, for that one. So the point here is you might be thinking, well, it's his captain's log, so the intended audience is himself. That's it. But like, we know that's not true, right? If you're Columbus and you just discovered a whole new continent, you know people are going to be reading your captain's log. Specifically, Europeans are going to be reading your captain's log. Even more specifically, the people funding your journey. They want to know what you were up to. You just were given a lot of money by the King and Queen of Spain to go on this random journey trying to find India, and they're going to want to make sure that you were doing that efficiently and you were using your resources well and that you were a good leader. And one of the sources they're going to look at is your captain's log. So with that intended audience in mind, it's the people giving you money, the king and queen. It makes sense that he might be exaggerating just how willingly they gave away everything they owned. That seems a pretty extreme statement. You might be making sure to emphasize their physical capabilities and how easily they can be subjugated, with the idea of trying to get the king and queen of Spain to give you more money to keep exploring, right? You want them to feel like their investment was worth it and that future investments will also be worth it. And that ties into purpose. One of the things is intended audience and purpose often kind of go hand in hand. So you often find yourself kind of shifting between those two like I just did, and that's totally fine. You don't have to worry about sticking to just one and only talking about the intended audience. So with that, let's look at purpose. It's kind of the other side of that coin. So why was the document originally created? And then how does that impact what's being shown? So if we look at this famous poem, The White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling, right? It's talking about how necessary it is for white people to go out and civilize the rest of the world, right? How difficult it is to be a white man in the late 19th century. And so, yeah, we could maybe talk about this. Let's say that DBQ prompt was something like evaluate European ideologies that impacted imperialism. Okay, well, we could talk about the civilizing mission and social Darwinism and perceived white superiority, that sort of thing. Then if we want to evaluate the purpose, why did Rudyard Kipling write this poem and why did he write it now? This is where, again, you need to have some outside knowledge. You might see the year 1898 and go, that seems like a year we learned about. If you're an A-push, you're like, yeah, I definitely know what that year is. He specifically says the white man's burden, the United States and the Philippine Islands. That's another clue. A lot of people actually don't know that this is the full title. So Rudyard Kipling specifically wrote this poem with the purpose of convincing the United States to annex the Philippines. The United States had just finished and won the Spanish-American War in 1898, and they had control of a lot of Spanish territories like the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba, and they were in the midst of debating what to do with them. Again, historical situation is coming in. That's totally fine. And so Rudyard Kipling, as a British imperialist who believed that the whiter races should control the main resources and control the important territories around the world, he was trying to convince the United States, another kind of white state, to take over the Philippines because they would be better than the English enemy, the Spanish, who had controlled them. And he also believed that they would be better than just the Filipino people governing themselves because the Philippine Islands were a really important base in Asia. So his whole purpose of writing this poem is to convince the United States Congress to annex the Philippines. And so, right, that's the important part, he might be really emphasizing this, like the nobility of this, send forth the best of your breed, right? Making them feel really important and also exaggerating the negative aspects of the people there and why it's important that they be subjugated. Now, finally, we have point of view, which is the one I think a lot of students really like to do. That makes sense. I think it's the most straightforward as long as you know who the author is. So if you're looking at a document and you see this and you go, I don't know who Sojourner Truth is, well, you might want to pick something else. Now, you don't have to know her life story. You might be able to gather her point of view from reading this document, but just be careful, right? You don't want to be too vague. So we're looking at who created the document and how does their perspective influence what's being said or being shown. So this is a speech called Ain't I a Woman? It was given at a women's rights convention in the United States in 1858. So historical situation, it's 10 years after Seneca Falls, right? And it's a few years before the Civil War is going to begin. So let's say that this DBQ prompt is evaluate the role of women in social movements, right? And so your answer is like, women were involved in social movements. Basically, in this speech, she's saying men are telling women that they need to be helped into carriages. They're basically too delicate. They need to be lifted over ditches. And then she's saying, nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. Ain't I a woman? She's going on and on saying, I've planted, I've worked the fields, I've been forced to do all of this really strenuous labor. But if women are so delicate, why was I forced to do those things? This is where it would be really helpful to know that Sojourner Truth was a former slave, right? And so she's talking about, she's a Black woman who was formerly enslaved and is talking about her experience as a female slave as a part of the women's experience. Okay, so the simple answer to the question is women were involved in social movements. Women were very actively involved because a lot of times movements for social progress like the abolition of slavery also meant social progress for women's status in the United States. But specifically for Sojourner Truth's point of view, her point of view as a Black woman is very different, right? And so she's pointing out that not all women were seen in the same way. And so there's this intersectionality, right? There's this relationship between race and gender that is also going to somewhat divide women, right? So in terms of how you might use this analysis to support your argument is you might say something like, women were really involved. However, there were sometimes divisions between different groups of women who had had different experiences. For example, rich white women and poor white women have different experiences in the United States, and Black and white women definitely have different experiences, especially in the 19th century, right? So that's how you would use point of view to support the argument that you're making about women's role in social movements. Great. So the last thing I want to leave you with is this basic idea. The most important step of this that I've been trying to do this whole time is so what? So you say Rudyard Kipling was a British imperialist and he was white. That's his point of view. Great. So what? Why do we care? So keep that in the back of your mind as you're writing. And I'm going to bring this back up next episode when we talk about outside evidence, right? It's not just about throwing out someone's point of view or identifying the intended audience. The most important part is then connecting it to whatever you're saying. Why do we care about that? As historians, why should we pay attention to who wrote that poem or who they were writing the poem for? What extra information does that tell us about the document? And on that, please join me next episode as we talk about outside evidence, which I think is maybe like the best and easiest 2 extra points that are anywhere on this rubric. So join me soon. I'll be posting that episode as soon as I get it out, all about outside evidence and again, how to use it to support your argument. Hope this was helpful. Thanks, y'all. Bye.